The doctors told my wife I had a 12% chance of waking up after the crash that caused my 6-month-long coma. My name is Nathan Cross. I am 44 years old, and I built a logistics company from nothing with a man I trusted completely. When I finally opened my eyes in that hospital room, my wife told me our company no longer legally belonged to me. My business partner, Gregory Voss, had spent those 6 months quietly convincing everyone involved that I was never coming back to run anything again. 10 years earlier, Gregory and I had started Cross and Voss Logistics with 2 trucks, 1 warehouse, and a handshake instead of a written contract. We built that company together from the ground up, working 18-hour days, sleeping in the office some nights, sharing every single risk equally. Gregory was the outgoing one, the man who charmed clients over dinner, while I handled the numbers, the routes, and the difficult daily decisions. For years, our partnership felt unbreakable, built on a friendship that started in college long before either of us ever imagined owning a business together. We met during our sophomore year of college, both broke, both ambitious, both convinced we would eventually build something meaningful together someday. Gregory borrowed money from his uncle for our first truck, while I sold my old car to cover our very first month of rent. Our wives became close friends too, spending holidays together, celebrating birthdays together, building an extended family neither of us had originally planned or expected. I remember the exact night we landed our first major client, celebrating with cheap pizza and warm beer in our tiny rented office. Gregory always said our partnership worked because we balanced each other perfectly, his charm against my caution, his risk against my careful planning. I never once imagined that same careful planning would eventually become the exact thing that saved everything we had built together over 10 years. By our 5th year in business, we had grown from 2 trucks to a small fleet of 12, employing nearly 40 people. Gregory handled our growing client relationships while I quietly managed the books, the payroll, and every difficult financial decision behind the scenes. Rachel used to joke that Gregory got all the glory while I did all the actual work that kept our company running. I laughed along with her back then, never once suspecting that the imbalance she teased me about would someday matter so much. I trusted Gregory with everything, including access to our company accounts, our client contracts, and eventually, foolishly, my own physical signature stamp. Looking back now, I can see small warning signs I chose to ignore, moments when Gregory made decisions without consulting me at all. He started taking longer lunches with our newest investors, meetings I was never once invited to attend or even told about afterward. My wife Rachel mentioned once that Gregory seemed different lately, quieter around me, more animated when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I dismissed her concerns at the time, telling her that running a growing company naturally created stress none of us had fully anticipated. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Driving home late from a client meeting Gregory had specifically asked me to attend alone. A truck ran a red light, and the last thing I remembered was headlights filling my entire windshield before everything went completely dark. I spent the next 6 months in a coma, my body slowly healing while decisions about my entire life were made without my knowledge. Rachel told me later that Gregory visited the hospital exactly twice during those 6 months, both times bringing flowers and carefully worded sympathy. What Gregory did not bring were the quarterly reports, the shareholder updates, or any honest information about what was actually happening at our company. Within the first month of my coma, Gregory quietly began restructuring our ownership agreement, citing an emergency clause buried deep in our original contract. That clause, one I barely remembered signing years earlier, allowed a surviving partner to assume full control if the other became medically incapacitated. The crash left me with 3 broken ribs, a fractured skull, and severe internal bleeding that required emergency surgery within the hour. Rachel told me later that the surgeons gave her almost no hope during those first critical 72 hours after the accident. She sat beside my hospital bed every single day, holding my hand, talking to me even though I could not respond at all. Emma and Josh visited on weekends, drawing pictures they taped to the wall beside my bed, hoping I would somehow notice them. The nurses told Rachel that patients in comas sometimes hear conversations happening around them, even if they cannot respond in any way. Rachel began reading me updates about the company every evening, unaware that Gregory was quietly using that same time to seize control. Doctors slowly reduced my sedation after 4 months, watching carefully for any small sign that my brain activity was steadily and finally improving. I remember flickers of consciousness before I truly woke, fragments of voices and light that never quite resolved into anything solid or clear. When I finally regained full consciousness, Rachel was the first face I saw, tears streaming quietly down her exhausted cheeks in complete relief. I could not speak yet, but I remember squeezing her hand as tightly as my weakened body would possibly allow me to. Gregory used that clause, along with a forged medical incompetency letter, to legally transfer my 40% ownership stake directly into his name. Our company's lawyer, a man named Peter Ellison, had been quietly replaced by Gregory during my coma with someone more willing to cooperate. Rachel discovered the ownership transfer almost by accident, opening mail addressed to me that contained a letter announcing my formal removal from the board. She confronted Gregory immediately, standing in his office demanding an explanation, and he told her calmly that he was simply protecting the company. He said the business could not survive without active leadership, and that my prolonged medical condition had left him no other reasonable choice. Rachel wanted to fight back immediately, but our family's lawyer warned her that Gregory's paperwork appeared, on the surface, to be entirely legitimate. Rachel spent nights after work searching through old emails, trying to piece together exactly when Gregory's plans had actually quietly begun forming. She found several old messages between Gregory and our lawyer discussing the exact incapacitation clause weeks before my accident had even happened. Those messages alone were not enough proof, our lawyer warned her, but they confirmed her growing suspicion that something was deeply wrong. She began quietly documenting everything herself, saving emails, screenshotting messages, building her own careful record of Gregory's suspicious behavior over those difficult months. Rachel never told me about this quiet investigation until months later, not wanting to burden me while I was still physically recovering. She told me once that watching Gregory smile at her during those months felt like watching a stranger wearing a familiar face. Our children noticed the tension too, Emma asking quietly one evening why Uncle Gregory no longer visited the hospital at all anymore. Rachel told her gently that grown-up problems were complicated sometimes, promising her everything would eventually work out fine in the end. Looking back, Rachel says those months of quiet investigation taught her a patience and resolve she never knew she actually had inside herself. She still keeps a folder of those early screenshots, calling it proof that persistence eventually pays off, even during the darkest months. Our hospital bills during those 6 months climbed past $400,000, money we no longer had reliable access to because of the transfer. Rachel sold her car, took a second job at a local pharmacy, and quietly began selling pieces of jewelry just to keep our household running. Our 2 children, Emma and Josh, watched their mother exhausted every single night while their father lay silent in a hospital bed nearby. I woke up in March, groggy and disoriented, unable to fully understand why my own wife looked so exhausted and defeated beside my bed. The doctors explained that memory and speech would return slowly, that my recovery would take months of careful physical and cognitive therapy. It took almost 3 weeks before I was strong enough to sit up and hear the full story of what had happened to our company. Rachel sat beside my hospital bed and explained, gently but honestly, exactly how Gregory had used my coma to take everything we had built. I remember feeling a strange numbness at first, my body too weak to process the full weight of what she was actually telling me. That numbness slowly turned into something sharper over the following days, a quiet determination growing steadily beneath my still healing exhausted body. I asked Rachel to bring me every single document related to the company that she could find, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. She brought boxes of paperwork to my hospital room, and I spent my recovery reading through years of contracts, emails, and financial statements. What I found confused me at first, because the numbers Gregory reported to our investors did not match my memory of our finances. I remembered, slowly and painfully, a decision I had made years earlier that Gregory himself had completely forgotten during his hasty takeover of the company. Long before the accident, worried about exactly this kind of betrayal, I had quietly kept a second set of detailed financial records myself. That second set of books lived not in our office computers, but in a locked fireproof safe inside my own home study, untouched by anyone. I had started keeping those private records 3 years earlier, after noticing small discrepancies in reports Gregory submitted to our original investors. At the time, I told myself I was simply being cautious, a habit from my accounting background rather than real suspicion of my friend. Rachel, unaware of what I had done years earlier, was startled when I asked her to retrieve a small metal key from my desk. She drove home that same afternoon and found the fireproof safe exactly where I had hidden it, tucked behind old family photo albums. Inside were 3 years of detailed ledgers, invoices, and bank statements documenting every single transaction Gregory and I had made as business partners. Comparing my private records against the numbers Gregory had submitted to investors during my coma revealed discrepancies I could barely believe existed. Gregory had been quietly siphoning money from client accounts for almost 2 years before my accident, funneling funds into a separate shell company. My private ledgers proved, in careful detail, that Gregory had systematically underreported revenue, while overstating expenses to hide the money he was stealing. The accident and my subsequent coma had simply given Gregory the perfect opportunity to accelerate a betrayal he had already been planning for years. I asked my accountant, a careful woman named Diane Foster, to quietly review my second set of books without telling anyone at the company. Diane confirmed within a week that the discrepancies were real, extensive, and almost certainly evidence of deliberate financial fraud committed over several years. I still had not fully recovered physically, but my mind was working with a clarity and focus I had not felt in years. Rachel asked me repeatedly whether we should simply move forward, take whatever settlement Gregory offered, and start a new life somewhere far away. I told her honestly that I could not simply walk away from 10 years of work while a man who betrayed me kept everything. I began meeting secretly with a lawyer named Victor Alvarez, a man Diane had personally recommended for cases involving corporate fraud and shareholder disputes. Victor reviewed my private ledgers carefully over several long meetings, confirming that the evidence I had gathered was strong enough to build a real case. Victor explained that we needed independent verification, someone outside our company who could confirm the ledgers were genuine and not fabricated in any way. Diane worked closely with a forensic accountant, Victor recommended, cross-referencing every transaction against Gregory's official reports for accuracy line by line. The forensic review took nearly 6 weeks, uncovering a pattern of falsified invoices stretching back almost 2 full years before my accident. Victor also gathered testimony from 2 former employees who had noticed strange irregularities in Gregory's expense reports well before my accident happened. One employee admitted she had been afraid to report her suspicions, worried Gregory would simply have her quietly fired instead for speaking up. Victor assured her that testifying now would protect not just our company, but every future employee from similar retaliation or fear going forward. We spent long evenings in Victor's office reviewing evidence, preparing carefully for the exact moment we would finally confront Gregory directly and completely. Rachel attended several of those meetings too, insisting she deserved to understand every detail of the case being built against Gregory carefully. Victor warned us repeatedly that Gregory would likely fight back hard once he realized exactly what evidence we had gathered against him carefully. By the time we finished preparing, our case file contained nearly 400 pages of documented, verified financial evidence against Gregory Voss. He explained that Gregory's forged medical incompetency letter, combined with the fraudulent financial records, could constitute serious criminal charges rather than simple civil disputes. Building the case took almost 4 months, gathering additional bank records, employee testimonies, and documentation proving Gregory's shell company existed solely to hide stolen funds. During those 4 months, I quietly continued my physical therapy while Gregory believed I was still recovering too slowly to pose any real threat. He visited the hospital one final time during my recovery, offering me a small settlement in exchange for permanently signing away my remaining rights. I smiled at him that day, thanked him politely for the offer, and told him I needed more time to think it over carefully. What Gregory did not know was that Victor and I had already scheduled a meeting with our company's remaining shareholders 3 weeks later. That meeting had originally been called by Gregory himself, intended as a formal vote to permanently ratify his full ownership of the company. I arrived at that shareholder meeting wearing a suit that no longer fit properly after months of hospital weight loss, but I stood tall anyway. Gregory's face went pale the moment I walked through the boardroom doors, clearly having assumed I was still too weak to attend in person. He tried to smile and welcome me warmly, telling the room how relieved he was to see his old friend finally back on his feet. I let him finish his welcome speech completely, watching him relax slightly, before I asked to address the shareholders regarding a serious matter. Victor stood beside me as I opened a leather folder containing copies of my private ledgers, ready to be distributed to everyone in the room. I explained calmly, without raising my voice once, exactly how Gregory had used my medical coma to forge documents and seize control illegally. I showed the shareholders bank statements proving the existence of a shell company Gregory had used to funnel stolen client funds for 2 years. Several shareholders gasped audibly as Diane, present as an independent financial witness, confirmed that my private records matched the discrepancies she had personally found. Gregory's face shifted rapidly from confusion to anger to something close to panic as the documents were passed slowly around the boardroom table. He tried to interrupt several times, insisting the numbers were misleading, that context was missing, that I had misunderstood complicated financial arrangements entirely. Victor calmly reminded the room that forging a medical incompetency letter alone was sufficient grounds for immediate criminal referral to the district attorney. One shareholder, a longtime investor named Harold Whitmore, asked Gregory directly whether he could explain the shell company's true ownership records in detail. Gregory could not answer that question, his silence stretching uncomfortably long across a boardroom table that had gone completely and totally silent. I watched years of quiet resentment and betrayal finally reach their breaking point in that room, though I felt strangely calm rather than triumphant. The shareholders voted unanimously that same afternoon to immediately suspend Gregory's ownership rights pending a full independent forensic investigation into the company's finances. Security escorted Gregory from the building within the hour, his face still frozen in the same disbelief he had shown when I first walked in. The remaining employees gathered quietly in the hallway afterward, many of them still processing the shock of what they had just witnessed. Diane found me in the empty boardroom afterward, placing a steady hand on my shoulder without saying a single word at all. I called Rachel from the parking lot immediately, my voice shaking as I told her everything had finally come crashing down for Gregory. She cried on the phone, relief and exhaustion finally breaking through months of careful composure she had maintained for our family the entire time. That evening, our entire family gathered at home for the first time in months, without a single unresolved threat hanging over us. Emma hugged me tightly, telling me she had overheard enough to understand that her father had finally beaten the bad man at his own game. Josh simply sat close beside me on the couch, quiet and content, not fully understanding everything but sensing the relief around him. I slept better that night than I had in over a year, the weight of betrayal finally beginning to lift from me. Within days, our company's original lawyer, Peter Ellison, filed formal fraud charges on my behalf, submitting my private ledgers as primary supporting evidence. The district attorney's office launched a full criminal investigation, subpoenaing Gregory's personal bank records and uncovering additional evidence of fraud I had not known about. Investigators found that Gregory had been planning to sell the company entirely within the next 6 months, cashing out before anyone discovered the missing funds. My accident and subsequent coma, investigators later determined, had simply accelerated a betrayal that Gregory had already been carefully planning for well over a year. Gregory's lawyer attempted several times to negotiate a quiet settlement, hoping I would accept a payout in exchange for dropping the criminal charges entirely. I refused every single offer, telling Victor that Gregory needed to face real consequences rather than simply disappearing quietly with whatever money remained. The forensic investigation eventually recovered nearly $800,000 in stolen funds, money that was returned directly to the company and its shareholders. Gregory was formally charged with forgery, embezzlement, and wire fraud, facing a potential sentence of up to 15 years if convicted on all counts. The trial took almost a year to reach its conclusion, months of testimony, evidence review, and careful cross-examination from both legal teams involved. I testified for 3 full days, walking the jury slowly through every page of the private ledgers I had kept hidden for years. Diane testified as well, explaining in careful technical detail exactly how she had identified the discrepancies between Gregory's reports and my private records. Rachel testified about the exhausting 6 months she had spent fighting to keep our family afloat while Gregory quietly dismantled everything we had built. Gregory's own former lawyer, the one he had installed during my coma, eventually testified against him in exchange for a reduced role in the case. That testimony revealed that Gregory had specifically instructed him to backdate several documents in order to make the ownership transfer appear entirely legitimate. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on every single charge brought against Gregory Voss. Watching him stand there as the verdict was read, I felt none of the satisfaction I had once imagined I would feel in that moment. What I felt instead was a quiet, exhausted relief, the sense of finally setting down a weight I had been carrying since I woke up. Gregory was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, along with an order to repay every remaining dollar he had stolen from the company. The company itself, now legally restored entirely to my ownership, needed months of careful rebuilding after the damage Gregory's fraud had caused our reputation. Diane agreed to stay on permanently as our chief financial officer, insisting on new safeguards that would make a betrayal like this harder to repeat. Peter Ellison returned as our full-time company lawyer, drafting a new partnership structure with far stricter oversight than our original handshake agreement ever had. Rachel finally quit her second job at the pharmacy, and we began repairing not just our finances but the strained parts of our marriage. Emma and Josh, who had spent nearly a year watching their parents fight for survival, finally saw their father return to something resembling normal life. I remember the first family dinner after the trial ended, all 4 of us sitting together without a single unresolved worry left. Rachel reached across the table that night and took my hand, telling me she had never doubted I would find a way through it. I told her the truth, that there were nights in that hospital bed when I genuinely believed we had already lost absolutely everything we owned. What saved us, I realized slowly over the following months, was not luck or timing, but a simple habit of careful documentation years earlier. I had kept those private records, not because I expected betrayal, but because I had learned, long ago, that trust alone was never enough. Gregory sent one letter from prison about 6 months into his sentence, apologizing briefly before asking whether I might consider reducing his restitution payments. I read that letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same fireproof safe that had once held the evidence that convicted him. I never responded, deciding that some chapters of a person's life deserve to remain closed rather than reopened for the comfort of someone else. Our company grew steadily over the following 2 years, expanding into 3 new states with contracts larger than anything Gregory and I built together. I hired new partners carefully this time, insisting on formal written agreements, independent audits, and complete transparency at every single level of our operations. Diane often jokes now that I have become almost obsessively careful with financial documentation, a habit she says probably saved the entire company twice over. I tell her honestly that I would rather be called overly cautious than ever again wake up to discover everything I built had quietly disappeared. Rachel and I renewed our wedding vows on our 15th anniversary, a quiet ceremony surrounded by close family and the friends who had stayed loyal. Standing there beside her, I thought about how close we had come to losing everything and how far we had traveled back from that edge. Emma, now studying business in college herself, tells people proudly that her father survived a coma and rebuilt an entire company from nothing twice over. Josh keeps a framed photograph of our original 2 trucks in his bedroom, a reminder, he says, that real success is built slowly and honestly. I still think about Gregory sometimes, not with anger exactly anymore, but with a quiet sadness for the friendship we once genuinely shared for years. We built something real together once, long before ambition and greed convinced him that betraying me was worth more than the friendship we had built. I do not know if he thinks about those early years the way I do, exhausted but happy, sleeping in that small warehouse office. What I do know is that the second set of books I kept out of caution saved everything my family had worked so hard for. People sometimes ask me if I regret trusting Gregory as completely as I once did during those early years of building our company together. I tell them honestly that I do not regret the trust itself, only the fact that I did not protect myself sooner against its cost. Trust, I learned slowly through all of this, does not require abandoning caution, and caution does not require abandoning trust in the people you love. I keep a small copy of that fireproof safe key on my keychain now, a quiet reminder of how close we came to losing everything. Rachel says I am different now, calmer somehow, as if surviving that entire ordeal finally taught me what actually mattered most in my life. I believe she is right, because the man who woke up from that coma cared less about the company than he did about his family. The company matters to me still, deeply, but it no longer defines me the way it once did before the accident changed everything permanently. I built it back stronger, not to prove anything to Gregory, but because Rachel, Emma, and Josh deserve the life we promised them. Every quarter now, I personally review our financial records alongside Diane, not out of suspicion toward my current partners, but out of hard-earned habit. That habit, born from betrayal, has become something closer to peace, a quiet discipline that lets me sleep soundly through every single night now. I stand in our original warehouse, now expanded 3 times over, and remember the spot where Gregory and I shook hands 10 years earlier. That handshake meant everything to me once, and in some strange way, even after everything that happened, part of it still does today. The difference now is that I understand exactly what a handshake can and cannot protect, and I have built accordingly around that hard lesson. Our company employs over 300 people now, families who depend on the same careful honesty that Gregory once tried so hard to destroy. I think about those employees often, especially during difficult decisions, remembering how close their livelihoods came to disappearing because of one man's greed and betrayal. Diane tells new hires during orientation that our company was built twice, once with trust alone, and once with trust reinforced by careful verification. I never planned to become a cautionary tale for other business owners, but I have shared my story more than once at local business seminars. Other entrepreneurs often ask me the same question afterward, whether keeping a second set of private records felt paranoid or excessive at the time. I tell them honestly that it felt uncomfortable, even a little dishonest toward my partner, until the moment it saved everything I had built. Looking back now, years removed from that hospital bed and that boardroom confrontation, I understand that betrayal rarely announces itself clearly before it actually happens. It arrives quietly, disguised as convenience, as trust, as the comfortable assumption that the people closest to you would never actually take everything away. I survived that betrayal not through luck or dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet habit of documentation most people would never think twice about keeping. That habit, small and unremarkable at the time, became the single most important decision I ever made in 10 years of building this company. Rachel still keeps that original fireproof safe in our home study, though its contents have long since changed to hold different, happier family memories now. Sometimes Emma asks to see the old key, turning it over in her hands, asking me to tell the story one more time before bed. I tell it to her honestly now, without exaggeration, exactly the way it happened, because she deserves to understand what her family actually survived together. I want my children to understand that justice does not always arrive quickly, and that patience, evidence, and preparation matter more than anger could. Gregory is still in prison as I write this, 3 years into his sentence, with several more years remaining before any possibility of release. I do not know what he thinks about most days, locked away with time to reconsider every single choice that led him to that boardroom. I know only that our company survived, that my family healed, and that the truth, however long it took, eventually found its way into daylight. There were nights during my recovery when I believed we would lose everything, our home, our company, and each other in the process. Rachel never let me believe that outcome was inevitable, sitting beside my hospital bed night after night reminding me we would find a way through. She was right, though neither of us could have predicted how we would get there, or how long that difficult journey would take. I think the hardest part of the ordeal was not the betrayal, but the months of powerlessness lying in that hospital bed unable to act. Waking up to find your life dismantled while you were unable to defend it teaches you something about resilience you can never prepare for. I am not the man who signed that partnership agreement with Gregory 10 years ago, full of trust and unprepared for what betrayal looks like. I am steadier now, more careful, but I have not become bitter, because bitterness, I have learned, only continues the damage Gregory caused our family. Instead, I choose gratitude for Rachel's persistence, for Diane's expertise, for Victor's legal guidance, and for the family that never gave up on me. Every year on the anniversary of the accident, we gather as a family and simply spend the entire day together, doing nothing productive at all. It is our way of remembering how close we came to losing everything, and how grateful we remain for the life we rebuilt together. I no longer measure success only in company revenue or shareholder returns, though both matter more to me now than they did before the accident. I measure it instead in ordinary Tuesday dinners, in Emma's laughter, in Josh's pride, and in Rachel's hand finding mine across our kitchen table. The company we rebuilt together stands as proof that betrayal, however devastating, does not always have to be the final chapter of the story. Sometimes the people who try hardest to take everything from us end up teaching us, painfully but permanently, how much we were capable of protecting. I kept a second set of books out of caution, never imagining it would one day become the thing that saved my family's future. If there is one lesson I would offer anyone building something with another person, it is this: protect what you build while you trust them. Trust and caution were never actually opposites, I learned, but two halves of the same careful foundation every lasting partnership genuinely needs to survive. I woke up from a coma to find my life stolen from me, and I rebuilt it slowly, deliberately, one honest decision at a time. That rebuilding took years, cost more than money could, and gave my family something Gregory's betrayal could never take away from us: our resilience. Standing today in the warehouse where it all began, I no longer feel the anger I once carried, only gratitude for how far we traveled. Rachel says the man who came out of that hospital bed was stronger than the one who went in, and I believe she is right. Emma wants to join the company someday, insisting she wants to learn everything, including the hard lessons about trust her father learned the difficult way. Josh, quieter and more cautious by nature, already asks thoughtful questions about contracts and safeguards whenever the topic of the company comes up at dinner. I answer every question honestly now, because I want my children prepared in ways I never was before Gregory taught me exactly what betrayal costs. The scars from that year remain, quiet and invisible, but they no longer define the man I have become since walking out of that hospital. What defines me now is the choice I made every day during recovery, to keep fighting rather than accept the loss Gregory assumed was final. I think of that choice often, especially on difficult days, remembering that resilience is rarely loud, dramatic, or immediate, but built slowly through deliberate effort. The second set of books I once kept out of caution became, in the end, the clearest proof that preparation matters more than we realize. I share this story now not for sympathy, but because I believe someone else out there might need the same reminder I needed myself. Protect what you build, even while you trust the people building it beside you, because trust alone was never quite enough to guarantee lasting safety. Our company today stands taller, stronger, and more carefully built than it ever was before, a living reminder of everything we fought to reclaim together. I still shake hands to seal important agreements, but every handshake now comes with paperwork behind it, a lesson Gregory taught me the hardest way. Rachel and I renewed more than our wedding vows that year. We renewed our belief that difficult chapters do not have to become permanent endings. Emma and Josh grew up watching their parents survive something most families never have to face, and I believe it made them quietly, permanently stronger. I am grateful, strange as it sounds, for the coma that nearly ended my life, because surviving it taught me what mattered most in mine. The company, the money, the boardroom victory, none of it compares to the relief of watching my family gathered around our kitchen table again. That is the story I tell now, not of revenge, but of patience, preparation, and the strength that carried my family through our darkest year. I built a company once out of trust alone, lost it briefly to betrayal, and rebuilt it permanently on something more durable, earned wisdom. If Gregory reads this story from wherever he is serving his sentence, I hope he understands that I do not carry hatred toward him anymore. What I carry instead is gratitude, for the family that never gave up, and for the habit of caution that saved everything we built. People often ask whether I would do anything differently if given the chance to relive those difficult years all over again from the very beginning. I always answer honestly that I would keep those private records again, without hesitation, regardless of how uncomfortable it once felt to do so. The lesson I hope others take from this story is simple. Protect yourself quietly, even while trusting someone completely and openly with your whole heart. Betrayal rarely comes from strangers, which is exactly why quiet preparation matters most within our closest, most trusted relationships in our lives. I do not regret building that company with Gregory, because the good years we shared were genuinely real and worth remembering even now. What changed was not the past we built, but the choice he made when everything I had was suddenly vulnerable and completely unprotected. I hope my children carry this story forward, not as a warning against trust, but as proof that preparation matters just as much. Our family survived something most people never have to face, and we came out of it stronger, closer, and wiser than we ever were before. I close this story the same way I closed that boardroom confrontation years ago, calmly, honestly, and with the certainty that the truth finds daylight.